You find yourself drifting gently through the thin veil of time. The familiar sounds of your own world begin to soften, receding like waves upon a distant shore. The sharp edges of the present blur, and a profound quiet begins to settle around you, a stillness that hums with the echoes of centuries past. You are not moving through space, but through memory, through the very fabric of existence, as if a great, slow breath is being drawn. The light around you changes, softening, becoming diffused, no longer the sharp glare of your known days, but a filtered, patient glow that suggests another dawn, another way of seeing. A faint scent begins to emerge from the stillness, something earthy and cool, mingled with the dry aroma of ancient stone and the lingering presence of wood smoke. It is a scent that speaks of time, of quiet endurance. You feel a subtle coolness on your skin, a dryness in the air that suggests thick walls, deep shadows. There is no urgency in this transition, no sudden jolt. Instead, it is a slow unfolding, like the quiet opening of a forgotten door, revealing a space that has always been there. Waiting, your own breath deepens, settling into a slower, more deliberate rhythm, as if aligning itself with the very pulse of this distant past. The ground beneath you, though unseen, feels firm, ancient, a foundation laid by hands long turned to dust. The air itself seems heavier, imbued with the weight of countless lives lived within its embrace, countless prayers whispered into its silence. You are not an observer here, but a quiet presence, a consciousness settling into the contours of another time, another way of being. The sounds that begin to emerge are soft, organic. The distant call of a bird, the subtle rustle of unseen fabric, the faint echo of water dripping somewhere in the quiet. It is a world that invites a different kind of attention, a deeper listening, a more patient observation. Your senses awaken to subtleties, to the nuances of light and shadow, to the faint whispers carried on unseen currents. This quiet transition is a gentle hand, guiding you deeper into a realm where time itself is felt rather than measured, where every sensation is an invitation to simply exist within the unfolding moment. The world that slowly reveals itself is built upon rock and earth, a landscape shaped by human hands and enduring nature. Structures rise not with the swiftness of modern construction, but with the patient accumulation of stone upon stone, or timber against timber. Most buildings, especially those for living, are of heavy timber and rough-hewn planks, their surfaces dark with age and smoke, sometimes filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven branches and clay, giving the walls a textured, earthy quality. Where stone is abundant, such as in the larger, more enduring buildings, the walls are thick, imposing, often with the marks of the mason's hammer still visible. These structures feel permanent, rooted to the very ground, absorbing the cold of winter and offering deep shade in summer. The roofs are typically heavy thatch, layers of dried reeds or straw, a living blanket that provides insulation, shedding rain with a soft patter and muffling the sounds from above. From openings in these roofs, or from rudimentary chimneys, a constant wisp of wood smoke curls upwards, a visual and olfactory sign of life and warmth within. This smoke permeates everything, clinging to clothes, hair, and the very air, a pervasive, comforting, and sometimes irritating aroma that defines human habitation. The ground underfoot is rarely even. Inside dwellings, it is often packed earth, hardened by years of foot traffic, perhaps covered with scattered rushes or coarsely woven mats, which offer a slight cushioning and absorb some of the dampness and dirt. Outside, pathways are simply trodden earth, turning to slick mud after rain, or hard-baked and dusty in dry seasons. The feel of the ground is immediate and unfiltered, the coolness of damp soil seeping through thin soles, the sharp pressure of a hidden stone, the squelch of mud between toes if one walks barefoot. There are no paved surfaces, only the direct, raw connection to the land itself, its textures changing with every season, every rainfall. The world is filled with organic sounds. the distant lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the sharp crow of a rooster marking the unseen passage of hours. The rustle of wind through tall grass or the leaves of trees, a pervasive, whispering presence. The rhythmic splash of water drawn from a well, the groan of its wooden pulley, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing from the edge of a village or monastery. Inside, the omnipresent crackle and hiss of a hearth fire, the soft thud of kneading dough, the rhythmic scrape of a wooden spoon against an earthenware pot. There are no abrupt, mechanical noises, no sudden roars or blares. The soundscape is fluid, alive with the subtle workings of nature and human endeavor, each sound distinct, yet blending into a continuous, natural hum. Even silence is not empty. It is filled with the presence of unseen creatures, the subtle movements of the air, the deep resonance of ancient stone structures. Textures are immediate, rough and honest. The unplaned surface of timber, its splinters a constant reminder of its raw origins. The cool, granular feel of rough-cut stone, absorbing and radiating the day's warmth or night's chill. The dry, brittle touch of straw, crumbling slightly between your fingers, or the soft give of fresh hay. Wool, often coarse and undyed, scratches persistently against the skin, yet provides essential warmth, its lanolin scent a reminder of its animal origin. Linen, spun by hand, feels softer, but still retains a subtle irregularity from its hand processing, far from the smooth refinement of later fabrics. Clay pots, unglazed and porous, hold water and food, their surfaces cool and slightly gritty to the touch, often smelling faintly of damp earth or their stored contents. Metal, when present, is usually iron, heavy and strong, often blackened by fire, its surface sometimes pitted from the blacksmith's hammer, giving it a tactile history. Every object speaks of its maker, its material, its purpose, its long use. Your fingers learn to read the language of these textures, their weight, their coolness, their subtle imperfections, each touch a conversation with the tangible world. Natural light dictates the rhythms of existence. There is no artificial illumination to extend the hours of work or leisure beyond the sun's decree. Dawn brings a slow, creeping illumination, a gentle gray that gradually strengthens, revealing the world in a soft, muted palette. Midday sees the sun at its most intense, casting sharp shadows outside, though often muted within dwellings by thick walls and small openings, creating pools of light and deep, cool shadows. As evening approaches, the light softens, turning golden, then deepens into twilight until only the faint glow of the moon and stars or the flicker of a fire or a single candle remains. Life adapts instinctively to this ebb and flow, rising with the sun, settling with its descent. Work is done by the light of day. Evenings are for quieter tasks, for shared warmth by the hearth, for storytelling in the flickering shadows, where faces are illuminated by dancing flames and the outside world recedes into darkness and silence. The absence of constant bright light encourages a different way of seeing, an appreciation for the subtleties of illumination, for the way a single flame can transform a vast, dark space, making the familiar unfamiliar and drawing people closer around the shared warmth. The tools of this era are extensions of the hand and body, crafted for specific tasks, often heavy and unrefined. Their surface is smoothed by repeated contact with human skin and the persistent friction of work. A wooden plow, dragged by oxen, turns the earth slowly, its blades biting into the soil with a steady, grinding sound, the smell of fresh earth rising behind it. Hand axes split logs with sharp, percussive blows, the scent of fresh wood filling the air, mingling with the scent of human effort. Simple looms weave thread into cloth, with a rhythmic clack and shuttle, the warp and weft creating a tangible manifestation of human patience and skill. Each tool carries the weight of its purpose, the history of its use etched into its worn handle, its sharpened edge, its very form speaking of generations of ingenuity applied to necessity. Daily rhythms are inextricably tethered to the cycles of the earth and the demands of subsistence. Planting, harvesting, tending animals, preparing food, mending clothes. These are not hobbies or occasional chores, but the very fabric of existence, demanding constant effort and attention, dictating the flow of the days and seasons, shaping the contours of every life. There is a deeply ingrained understanding of the interdependence between human effort and nature's bounty, a profound respect for the source of all sustenance. These rhythms are not imposed by a clock, but by the needs of the body and the land, by the rising and setting of the sun, by the hunger that grows within the belly. Spaces are defined by function and necessity. The single-room dwelling, serving as kitchen, bedroom, and gathering place, its center always the hearth, radiating warmth and life, the air thick with the memory of countless meals and conversations. The byre, sheltering animals close to human warmth, their soft breathing and warmth a constant presence, their specific animal scent a familiar part of the household air. The communal well, a focal point for gathering and exchange, its cool water drawn up bucket by bucket, a vital resource, its stone lip worn smooth by countless hands. The church, its stone walls cold and echoing, offering spiritual solace and a sense of order, a place of quiet contemplation and communal prayer, its interior often darker and more hushed than any other building. The fields, stretching outwards, the source of life, their contours shaped by generations of labor, their colors shifting with the seasons, green in spring, golden in summer, brown and fallow in winter. There is a deep connection to the land, a dependency that is felt in every fiber of being, an understanding that life itself is granted by the earth's generosity. Existence here is raw, immediate, and utterly bound to the natural world. It is a life lived in constant dialogue with the elements, with the rhythms of growth and decay, with the simple, unchanging truths of earth and sky. Every action, every material, every sound speaks of a world deeply intertwined with its environment, where survival is a daily, tangible effort, and time is measured by the sun's passage and the turning of the seasons. For some, the world as described, with its rhythms of earth and sky, its tangible realities of labor and sustenance, became a source of profound unease. The relentless cycle of sowing and reaping, the constant threat of hunger or sickness, the fleeting nature of earthly joys, these could lead a soul to seek a different path, a different kind of existence. The world outside the monastery walls, with its endless demands and its fleeting comforts, became something to be renounced, to be left behind. And so, a man or a woman would arrive at the heavy, silent gates of a monastic house, drawn by forces that had shaped their very being. The reasons people became monks were varied, yet deeply personal, rooted in the very fabric of their lives. For some, it was the crushing weight of poverty, a relentless hunger that gnawed at the belly and withered the spirit. The monastery offered a promise of regular, if meager, sustenance, a roof over one's head, and a life free from the ceaseless anxiety of the next meal. The cold stone walls, the simple fare, the coarse habit, these were perceived as a form of security, a refuge from the precariousness of the outside world. The constant gnawing of hunger, the chill of an ill-heated hovel, the endless debt, these could push a soul towards the quiet, disciplined life within the cloister, where at least the basic needs were met, even if comfort was absent. The scent of bread baking within the monastery walls, the warmth radiating from the communal hearth, the sound of steady, purposeful work. These held a different kind of promise for those who had known only scarcity. For others, it was the subtle yet pervasive force of family pressure. A younger son, with no inheritance or land to claim, might be guided towards the cloister, his future decided not by his own inclination, but by the necessity of his kin. A daughter, with no dowry or suitable match, might find her only honorable path within a convent, her life chosen for her by the circumstances of her birth. The unspoken expectation, the gentle but firm insistence of elders, the weight of tradition, These could be as binding as any vow. There was a quiet resignation in their steps as they approached the monastery gates, an acceptance of a destiny shaped by forces larger than themselves. Their hands, though perhaps accustomed to other labors, would learn the new rhythms of monastic life. Their voices would learn the new chants. Their hearts would learn a new form of obedience. Then there was the profound, aching burden of guilt. A life lived in the world, with its temptations and its inevitable transgressions, could weigh heavily on a sensitive soul. The fear of eternal damnation, painted in vivid, terrifying strokes by the local priest, could drive a man or woman to seek penance, to seek absolution through a life of rigorous self-denial and unwavering prayer. The cold stone, the fasting, the endless repetition of psalms, these were perceived not as punishments, but as pathways to spiritual purification, a means of cleansing the soul from the stains of sin. The very air within the monastery walls, permeated by centuries of fervent prayer, seemed to offer a promise of salvation, a refuge from the fires of hell. The memory of a harsh word, a selfish act, a moment of weakness, could linger like a bitter taste, pushing one towards the monastic life as a desperate plea for divine mercy. The scent of old incense within the chapel, the flickering light of a single lamp before an icon, the soft murmur of collective prayer, these held a promise of forgiveness, a balm for a troubled conscience. And sometimes it was sheer spiritual fear, a deep existential dread of the unknown, of the capricious nature of fate, of the terrifying power of an unseen God. The world outside seemed chaotic, unpredictable, full of unseen dangers. The monastery, with its strict rules, its unyielding routine, its constant invocation of divine protection, offered a sense of order, a predictable path through the bewildering complexities of existence. It was a fortress against chaos, a haven where one could dedicate oneself entirely to placating the divine, to earning a place in the afterlife. The resounding echo of the bell calling to prayer, the solemn procession through the cloister, the very solidity of the monastic walls, these created a tangible sense of security, a shield against the terrors of the spiritual realm. Finally, for some, the monastery became a refuge for social failure. A craftsman whose skills had faltered, a merchant whose ventures had collapsed, a scholar whose mind had dimmed, or simply one who could not navigate the intricate social landscape of the village. The monastic life offered a quiet exit, a place where the demands of the outside world simply ceased to apply. There was no need to prove oneself, no need to compete, no need to strive for worldly success. The uniform of the habit, the anonymity of the shared life, offered a liberation from the burden of individual aspiration and the judgment of others. It was a place where one could simply exist, fulfilling a prescribed role, without the constant pressure of external expectations. The quiet acceptance of a communal purpose, the steady rhythm of shared labor, the absence of individual ambition, these offered a different kind of peace, a solace for those who had found themselves adrift in the currents of the world. The psychological experience of renouncing the outside world was profound, a fundamental reshaping of identity. The journey to the monastery gate was often a final farewell to all that had been known. As one stepped across the threshold, a tangible line was crossed, a world irrevocably left behind. There was no looking back, no return. The sounds of the world, the laughter of children, the barking of dogs, the murmur of a market would fade, replaced by the hushed tones of the cloister. The most immediate and intimate change was the cutting of ties, family, friends, former loves. These relationships, which had formed the very warp and weft of one's identity, were severed. Letters, if they existed, were rare and formal. Visits, even rarer, were strained, marked by a palpable distance. The emotional bonds, though perhaps never truly broken in the heart, were physically and socially dissolved. There was a quiet grieving for the lost connections, a subtle ache that might settle in the chest during the long, silent hours of prayer. The memories of specific faces, of shared moments, would linger like ghosts, sometimes bringing a fleeting warmth, sometimes a sharp pang of loneliness. The scent of a distant hearth, carried on the wind, could evoke a sudden, silent yearning for a life that was no longer theirs. Then came the losing of one's name. The name given at birth, the name that had defined one's place in the family and the world, was shed like an old skin. A new name, often chosen by the abbot, or a symbolic name reflecting a saint or virtue, was bestowed. This act was a profound severing of the past self, a deliberate erasure of former identity. One became simply brother, new name, or sister, new name, a part of a larger collective body, anonymous within the monastic community. The sound of the new name, unfamiliar at first, would gradually become their own, its resonance defining their new existence. The very concept of I began to dissolve, replaced by we. The essence of the monastic life was uniform obedience. Every aspect of existence was governed by a strict rule, often Benedictine, a meticulous framework that dictated every hour, every gesture, every thought. There was no room for individual will, for personal preference, for dissent. Obedience was not merely an action, but a state of being, a constant submission of the self to the authority of the abbot or abbess, and ultimately, to God. This uniform obedience extended to the simplest acts, the way one walked, the way one ate, the way one spoke, or, more often, remained silent. The body became an instrument of divine will, its impulses disciplined, its desires suppressed. The mind, too, was trained to conform, to empty itself of worldly thoughts, to focus solely on spiritual devotion. The very air of the cloister seemed oppressed down with this expectation of surrender. The echoing footsteps of the monastic brethren moving in unison, the whispered responses of shared prayer, the very stillness of their postures during silent reflection, all spoke of this profound collective submission. The daily routines from the novice's point of view were a relentless, unyielding progression of spiritual and physical duties marked by the tolling of the bell. The sleep was broken, shallow. The day began in profound darkness, long before the sun had even contemplated its ascent. The sensation of waking before dawn was a common one, a jolt from slumber into the frigid air of the dormitory. The body, stiff and heavy with sleep, resisted the call, but the sound of the bell, echoing through the cold stone corridors, was absolute. There was no lingering, no indulgence. Feet, accustomed to the chill, would find the rough, cold fabric of the habit, pulling it quickly over the sleep-warmed skin. The journey to the chapel for prayers in the dark was a sensory experience of cold and stillness. Bare feet, or feet in thin sandals, would shuffle across cold stone floors, the chill seeping directly into the bones. The air in the cloisters was often biting, damp with the lingering moisture of the night. The only illumination would be the faint, wavering light of a few small lanterns carried by the monks, or the even fainter glow of the moon through high, unglazed windows, casting long, dancing shadows that distorted the familiar forms of the architecture. The scent of cold stone, of dampness, of faint, lingering incense would fill the air. Voices, hushed and low, would begin the ancient chants, their sounds resonating strangely in the vast, unlit space. The eyes would strain in the darkness, trying to discern the forms of fellow brothers or sisters, but mostly, one simply existed in the embrace of the dark, listening to the familiar words, feeling the pervasive cold. Meals were moments of necessity, not indulgence, marked by an austere silence. In the refectory, the long wooden tables, scrubbed raw, felt cool beneath the hands. The scent of plain, often bland food, perhaps coarse bread, a thin gruel or boiled vegetables, would fill the air, mingling with the ever-present smell of wood and old stone. The eating was done in silent meals, broken only by the low, steady voice of a reader, reciting scripture or passages from the lives of saints. The scraping of wooden spoons against earthenware bowls, the tearing of bread, the quiet sounds of chewing, these were the only audible accompaniments to the reader's voice. There was no conversation, no sharing of thoughts, no personal connection through words. The focus was on sustenance, on spiritual nourishment from the readings, and on the cultivation of inner stillness. The food itself, simple and often repetitive, was consumed without comment, its taste a mere function. The feeling of the coarse bread in the mouth, the warmth of the thin gruel, the cool hardness of the communal bench beneath the body, these were the tangible realities of mealtime. The cold stone floors were a constant presence, a pervasive sensation throughout the day. In the dormitory, in the cloister, in the chapel, in the refectory, everywhere the feet touched the unyielding, frigid surface. The cold seeped upwards through thin sandals or bare feet, chilling the bones, a constant physical discomfort that was simply accepted, a part of the monastic discipline. It was a grounding presence, a reminder of the material world, even within a life dedicated to the spiritual. The rough texture of the stone, sometimes uneven, sometimes damp, was felt keenly through the worn soles of one's feet. The early training of a novice was a rigorous process of breaking down the old self and forging a new one, a constant shaping of mind and body. The days were filled with repetition, with strictures, with the unwavering demand for conformity. The memory, a vessel for the ancient texts and melodies, was constantly exercised. The memorization of rules was paramount, the rule of Saint Benedict, or whatever specific rule governed the order, had to be known intimately, its hundreds of clauses absorbed into the very fabric of one's being. Hours were spent in quiet recitation, the mind striving to hold the complex web of injunctions and precepts. Failure to recall a specific passage, to articulate a particular requirement, could lead to subtle, unspoken disapproval, a weight of disappointment in the air. The words themselves, dry and formal, became a constant internal monologue, shaping thought. Alongside the rules, the Latin chanting filled the hours. The ancient tongue, unfamiliar at first, slowly began to find its rhythm within the body. Hours were spent in the scriptorium or in quiet corners, practicing the complex melodies, the precise intonation, the specific cadences of the psalms and hymns. The throat would ache, the voice would grow hoarse, but the repetition was relentless. The sound of dozens of voices, striving for unison, would fill the chapel, a powerful, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very stone. The feeling of the vibrations in the chest, the effort of sustained sound, became a part of the physical experience of devotion. For a novice, the effort to match the experienced monks, to find the right pitch, the correct timing, was a constant internal struggle. For errors, both in rote learning and in conduct, and for any hint of internal conflict or disquiet, there were punishments for errors or doubt. These were rarely violent, but often deeply humiliating, designed to break the will, to foster submission. A missed line in a chant, a whispered word in the refectory, a faltering step in a procession. These might lead to public correction, to kneeling for hours in the cold, unyielding space of the chapel, or to solitary contemplation separated from comforting presence of the community. The chilling silence of a lone vigil, the pervasive cold of the stone, the gnawing anxiety of introspection, these were the instruments of correction. For signs of doubt, of questioning the rigid doctrines, the punishments were more severe, aimed at purging the soul of dangerous thoughts. The heavy weight of disapproval from the abbot, the chilling gaze of a senior monk, the subtle ostracization from the community, these could be more potent than any physical discomfort, designed to extinguish any spark of individual questioning. The very air around one seemed to thicken with the weight of unspoken judgment. The ultimate goal of this rigorous training was the loss of personal agency, a complete submission of the individual will to the collective and to God. The self, as an independent entity, was systematically dismantled. The most tangible manifestation of this was the shared dormitories. There was no private space, no quiet corner where one could retreat into personal solitude. Rows of simple beds, straw mattresses on rough wooden frames, were arranged in common sleeping areas. The sounds of dozens of breathing bodies, the subtle shifts and turns in sleep, the shared air, these were the constant realities of night. The dim light, always present from a night lamp, created an atmosphere of perpetual observation, where even sleep was a communal experience. The rough woolen blankets, the faint rustle of straw, the pervasive scent of many bodies, these were the tactile and olfactory sensations of a shared slumber. Work was always assigned work. There was no choice in one's daily tasks, no opportunity to pursue personal inclination or talent beyond what was deemed necessary for the monastic community. One might be sent to the fields to labor under the sun, feeling the sharp bite of the hoe against the hard earth, the relentless ache in the back, or to the scriptorium to copy texts in the dim, cool light, the scratching of the quill against parchment, a constant, rhythmic sound. Or to the kitchen, preparing simple meals, the steam from boiling pots clouding the air, the scent of plain food filling the space. Or to the infirmary, tending to the sick, the smell of illness, a heavy, pervasive presence. Each task was a duty, performed not for personal satisfaction, but for the good of the community, for the glory of God. The constant supervision, the unspoken expectation of diligent effort, shaped every movement, every action, and through it all, there was a complete absence of privacy. Every moment, every action was potentially observed. In the dormitory, in the refectory, in the cloister, even in the latrines, there was no secluded corner, no hidden space. Thoughts, if they deviated from the path of devotion, were to be confessed, revealed to a spiritual elder. The very notion of an inner world, separate and hidden, was challenged. The constant presence of others, the shared tasks, the communal rituals, these fostered an environment where the individual self was constantly subsumed into the larger identity of the monastic order. The subtle shifts in light and shadow across the stone walls of the dormitory, the echoing footsteps in the cloister, the communal breathing in the chapel, these were the constant reminders of a life lived without walls, without secrets, completely, open to the gaze of the community and ultimately to the unwavering gaze of the divine. The cold stone underfoot, the rough wool against the skin, the pervasive scent of old habits and new dust, all contributed to this profound reshaping of self, a constant, tangible presence of renunciation. The profound absence of privacy continued to shape every moment, a constant reminder of the self subsumed. The rough wool of the habit clung to the skin, its texture a familiar friction, carrying the faint, indistinguishable scent of shared space. The cold stone floor, a constant presence beneath the feet, radiated a persistent chill, grounding each step in the stark reality of the monastic life. The sounds of shared breathing in the dormitory, the rhythmic creak of wooden frames, the subtle shifts of bodies in sleep. These were the intimate noises of a life lived perpetually in common, where the individual was always part of a larger, undifferentiated whole. No thought, it seemed, could truly be held alone. The very air within the monastic walls was saturated with the invisible yet palpable presence of the rule of Saint Benedict. It was not merely a set of instructions, but a living, breathing entity, permeating every stone, every breath, every silent gesture. Its grip on daily life was absolute, unwavering, a constant, unseen hand guiding every moment from the first stirrings before dawn until the final descent into sleep. This grip was articulated in two fundamental pillars, ora et labora, prayer and labor. These two commands were not distinct tasks, but interwoven strands, forming the very fabric of existence, each feeding the other, each demanding the entirety of the self. The ora, the prayer, was a ceaseless river flowing through the day and night. It was the primary purpose, the sacred breath of the monastic community. The mind was to be constantly attuned to the divine, the heart perpetually raised in supplication. This meant a meticulous devotion to the divine office, a series of prescribed prayers and chants that marked the passage of the hours. The labora, the labor, was the grounding, the physical manifestation of devotion. It was the work of hands, of body, sustaining the community, maintaining the cloister, turning the earth, preparing the sustenance. This labor was not a distraction from prayer, but another form of it, a physical offering, a tangible expression of obedience and humility. Every planted seed, every stirred pot, every copied word on parchment became an act of worship, a silent offering to the unseen. The body, though weary, became an instrument of this dual purpose, its efforts absorbed into the larger rhythm of spiritual work. The day itself was not measured by the sun's exact position, nor by the individual's desire, but by the relentless, unquestioning summons of the bells. Hour by hour, their deep, resonant tones vibrated through the cold stone, a physical command that pulled the body and mind from whatever task or repose held it. Each toll was a sacred punctuation, a reminder of the unceasing flow of divine time. The first bell shattered the deepest part of the night, long before the sky held any hint of light. This was matins, the night vigil, pulling sleeping bodies from the straw mattresses into the biting cold of the dormitory. Bare feet, or feet in thin sandals, would shuffle across the frigid stone floors, a soft scraping sound in the profound darkness. The air was thick with the chill of deep night and the faint, unsettling scent of cold, ancient stone. In the chapel, illuminated only by the faint, wavering glow of a few oil lamps, or the thin, ethereal light of the moon through high windows, voices would rise, low and guttural, then swelling into ancient chants, their sounds vibrating through, chest reverberating off the unadorned walls. The eyes strained in the dimness, trying to discern the forms of fellow monks, but mostly one existed in the embrace of the dark, feeling the cold, hearing the relentless repetition of psalms. The air would grow heavy with their collective breath, a visible mist in the deep chill. A few hours later, just as the first pale light began to touch the eastern sky, came lauds. The light in the chapel would be a ghostly gray, slowly strengthening as the chanting continued. The air might still hold the dampness of dawn, a pervasive coolness that seeped into the bones. The voices, perhaps still thick with sleep, would find a new clarity, rising with the burgeoning light. The rhythmic sway of bodies, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, accompanied the flow of the prayers, a communal dance with the emerging day. The scent of lingering incense from the night before mingled with the fresh, crisp air of the morning. With the sun barely above the horizon, the bell would call again for prime. This was the prayer of the first hour, ushering in the formal start of the day's labor. The light would now be clearer, illuminating the imperfections in the stone, the texture of the rough habits. The chill in the air would begin to lessen, slowly yielding to the sun's gentle warmth. The movements of the monks would be more purposeful, their bodies preparing for the work ahead. Then, at the third hour, terse. The sun would be higher now, its warmth beginning to permeate the cloister, taking the edge off the lingering chill. The sounds of early morning work might already be heard in the distance, the distant thud of an axe, the lowing of animals. Within the chapel, the voices would be stronger, clearer, no longer shadowed by the night's sleep. The air would begin to carry the faint, earthy scent of disturbed soil from the fields, or the dry, papery smell of parchment from the scriptorium, subtly blending with the ancient smell of stone and old wood. Midday brought sext. The sun would be at its zenith, casting sharp, defined shadows outside the thick walls. Inside the chapel, pockets of light might fall across the stone floor, illuminating dancing dust motes, tiny, silent witnesses to the ceaseless prayer. The heat of the day would be building, and a faint stickiness might begin to form on the skin beneath the heavy habits. The chanting at this hour might feel more effortful, a pushing against the natural fatigue of the day, a constant discipline of the body. The sounds of labor outside would be at their most active, a background hum against the solemnity of the prayers. As the sun began its slow descent, the bell for none would sound, marking the 9th hour. The light would be softening, beginning its transition towards evening. A profound weariness would begin to settle in the body, the accumulated exhaustion of hours of prayer and labor. The voices in the chapel might carry a subtle note of this fatigue, a quiet strain. The air would be heavy with the scent of the day's work, mingling with the lingering aromas of wood smoke and old stone. The knowledge of the approaching evening and a brief respite from intense labor would offer a faint, unspoken anticipation. With the deepening twilight, vespers called, the evening prayer. The chapel would be growing dim, the forms of the monks becoming blurred once more. The air would feel cooler, drawing in the chill of the evening. The sound of the chants would carry a different weight, a solemnity born of the day's completion, a turning towards the quiet introspection of night. The light of small lamps might be lit, their flickering glow casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the figures appear like solemn, ancient specters. Finally, just before the deepest sleep, came Compline, the last prayer of the day. The chapel would be almost entirely dark, save for a few faint lights. The air would be cold, a deep, pervasive chill that reminded the body of the encroaching night. Voices, low and hushed, would offer the final prayers, a quiet surrender to the darkness, a final act of devotion before the brief, precious hours of sleep. The silence that followed the last chanted word would be profound, thick with the weight of the completed day, a quiet expectation of the relentless cycle to begin anew in just a few hours. The most pervasive element shaping daily existence, apart from the physical demands, was the pressure of silence. It was an omnipresent force, a palpable presence that permeated every corner of the monastic life. To never speak freely was not simply a rule, but a profound reshaping of communication, of identity. Conversation, as the outside world knew it, was largely absent. In the refectory, the reader's voice was the only sound. In the cloister, during manual labor, only necessary instructions, delivered in low tones, were permitted. The very act of forming words, of articulating a personal thought, became an act of transgression, a violation of the sacred quiet. This enforced silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was an active cultivation of internal stillness, a discipline designed to quiet the restless mind, to turn attention inward, towards God. The throat would ache from unspoken words, the mind would buzz with unexpressed thoughts, but the will was trained to suppress them. The sensation of unspoken words pressing against the lips, of unarticulated feelings simmering within, was a constant, subtle pressure. The air in the cloister seemed to absorb these unvoiced thoughts, holding them in its cool, still embrace. Yet monks found ways to speak through gestures. A complex, unwritten language of hand signals emerged, a silent vocabulary understood by all. A gesture to indicate bread, a movement to ask for water, a subtle nod to convey understanding, a gentle shake of the head for dissent. These were not expressive movements, but precise, economical signals, conveying only the most basic information. The hands became articulate, their subtle movements holding the weight of unspoken needs. The eyes, too, spoke, conveying quiet exhaustion, shared understanding, or unspoken resignation in fleeting glances. The shift of a shoulder, the slight inclination of a head, the subtle tightening around the eyes, these became the nuanced vocabulary of a silent world. The sound of bare feet shuffling on stone, the soft rustle of habits, the almost imperceptible sounds of breath. These were the true conversations, the pervasive hum of bodies existing in shared, disciplined silence. Monastic labor was the physical counterpoint to ceaseless prayer. It was heavy, often monotonous work, designed not only to sustain the community, but also to discipline the body and mind, to humble the spirit. The labor was essential, providing food, clothing, shelter, and the very materials for study and worship. Yet it was the relentless, numbing repetition that characterized so much of it. In the bakery, the air was thick with the warm, earthy scent of rising dough, mingling with the pervasive smell of wood smoke from the large ovens. Hands, strong and calloused, kneaded the heavy, yielding mass of dough, hour after hour, the rhythmic thud against the wooden board a constant sound. The heat from the ovens radiated through the air, bringing a flush to the face, a subtle sheen of sweat to the brow. The same movements repeated endlessly, the feel of the flour on the skin, the warmth of the rising bread, the rhythmic motion of the arms. This was the labor of baking. The smell of freshly baked bread, though comforting, quickly became merely a part of the air, another element in the sensory landscape. In the garden, the hands became intimately acquainted with the cold, damp earth. The scent of turned soil, of damp roots, of green growing things would fill the air. The back would ache from long hours of bending, weeding, planting. The feel of rough soil on the skin, the cool touch of damp leaves, the slight give of the ground beneath the knees. These were the tangible realities of gardening. The passage of seasons dictated the tasks, but the fundamental movements of tending, of weeding, of harvesting remained constant, a slow, unending cycle. The sun on the neck, the wind on the face, the persistent gnawing of hunger in the belly. These physical sensations underscored the simple necessity of this work. In the scriptorium, the atmosphere was different, cool, quiet, permeated by the subtle scent of old parchment, of iron gall ink, of beeswax from the lamps. The light, though precious, was often dim, straining the eyes. The work was precise, meticulous, demanding endless patience. A quill, finely sharpened, scratched rhythmically across the parchment, each stroke a deliberate act. The sounds were minute, the gentle rustle of a page, the soft snip of a quill being repointed, the almost imperceptible sounds of breath. This was the labor of copying texts, the slow, painstaking reproduction of sacred words, illuminated manuscripts, and scholarly works. The fingers would cramp, the back would ache from hours bent over the desk. But the work continued, a constant meditation on the written word, a tangible contribution to the preservation of knowledge. The feel of the smooth parchment beneath the palm, the subtle resistance of the quill on its surface, the occasional blot of ink. These were the intimate sensations of this quiet, demanding work. The faint smell of drying ink, metallic and sharp, would linger in the air. And for this very work, there was the labor of making ink. The process was slow, often messy, involving precise measurements and careful grinding. The scent of oak galls, sometimes sharp and tannic, sometimes earthy, would fill the air as they were crushed. The sound of the pestle grinding against the mortar, a rhythmic scrape and thud, would accompany the hours spent preparing the basic components. Then, the careful mixing with iron sulfate, with gum arabic, the liquid slowly combining, transforming into the dark, viscous fluid. The fingers might become stained, their tips perpetually tinged with the deep, enduring color of the ink. A tangible sign of this particular, meticulous labor. The smell of the chemicals, sharp and distinct, would cling to the hands and to the air round the workstation. These various forms of labor, though seemingly different, shared a common thread. The numbing repetition. The same movements, the same smells, the same quiet focus, hour after hour, day after day. It was a discipline of the body, a constant reminder of humility, of the absence of personal choice. The mind, if not carefully guarded, could drift, could rebel against this endless cycle. The constant physical demands, the deep weariness that settled in the limbs and behind the eyes, were themselves a form of spiritual exercise, a perpetual offering of discomfort. Beneath the veneer of silence and obedience, a persistent internal struggle often simmered, conflicts and inner rebellion. The monastic life, in its relentless pursuit of spiritual purity, often magnified the very human frailties it sought to subdue. The mind, deprived of external stimulation and personal expression, could become a battleground, a source of profound disquiet. A pervasive sense of guilt over intrusive thoughts was a constant companion. The rule demanded purity of thought, a constant focus on the divine. Yet the mind, by its very nature, was prone to wandering, to recalling fragments of the outside world, to imagining forbidden pleasures, to harboring unspoken resentments. These thoughts, appearing unbidden, would be immediately recognized as transgressions, a violation of the monastic vow. A wave of shame would wash over the monk, a cold, sickening feeling that settled in the stomach. The heart would quicken. The breath would catch. Hours might be spent in silent self-recrimination, in desperate attempts to drive these unwanted images from the mind. The very effort to suppress them often made them more insistent, more vivid, creating a torturous internal cycle. The silence of the cloister, intended for spiritual contemplation, could become a vast, echoing space for these unwelcome mental battles. Sleep, when it came, offered little true respite. Nightmares, vivid and unsettling, would often plague the slumber of those who had renounced the world. Dreams of forgotten faces, of forbidden feasts, of the cacophony of the world outside, would crash through the carefully constructed peace of the day. The body would thrash, the breath would quicken, a silent struggle against the terrifying visions. Waking in the cold darkness of the dormitory, the heart pounding, the body slick with a cold sweat, the memory of the nightmare would cling like a shroud, a visceral reminder of the unruly subconscious, a further source of guilt and fear. The deep chill of the stone floor, the cold presence of the night air, seemed to amplify the terror of these nocturnal visitations. The sheer physical exhaustion was a constant, pervasive presence. The body ached from long hours of prayer, from bending over garden plots, from the relentless copying in the scriptorium, from the broken sleep in the cold dormitory. The eyes would feel heavy, gritty. The limbs would be leaden. Every movement would be an effort, every step a conscious act of will. This exhaustion was not merely physical tiredness, it was a deep, bone-weary fatigue that settled into the very soul, making resistance difficult, making the spirit feel heavy, dull. The scent of unwashed habit, of stale sweat, intensified as the body pushed through its weariness. And overriding all these internal struggles was the omnipresent fear of damnation. The constant sermons, the vivid depictions of eternal torment, the terrifying certainty of divine judgment. These were deeply ingrained in the monastic psyche. Every error, every intrusive thought, every moment of doubt could be perceived as a step closer to the abyss, a sign of one's unworthiness. The cold stone of the chapel, the echoing voices of the chants, the stark images of saints and sinners on the walls, these all contributed to an atmosphere saturated with the weight of spiritual consequence. This fear was not an abstract concept. It was a visceral, chilling sensation that tightened the chest, quickened the breath, and intensified the desperation for unwavering obedience. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the unspoken terror of the soul's ultimate fate, a constant, low hum beneath the relentless rhythm of Ora et Labora. The very darkness of the night, when the bells called for matins, seemed to hold the silent, unseen specter of spiritual peril. The internal struggles, the nightmares, the constant exhaustion, and the pervasive fear of damnation continued to press upon the spirit, even as the bells ceaselessly marked the hours. The rough fabric of the habit, a familiar rasp against the skin, became a second skin, its texture a constant reminder of the body's confinement. The cold stone underfoot, the pervasive scent of old habits and new dust, all contributed to this profound reshaping of self. A tangible presence of constant renunciation. The body, already weary from ceaseless prayer and numbing labor, found little respite in its sustenance. Life within the monastic walls was shaped by poor nutrition and constant fasting, a deliberate austerity designed to humble the flesh and elevate the spirit. The food, when it appeared, was often meager, lacking in variety, and prepared with an intentional plainness. Coarse bread, often hard and dense, formed the bulk of each meal, its texture rough against the tongue, its taste often flat. Thin gruel, made from oats or barley, offered little sustenance beyond a temporary filling of the belly. Boiled vegetables, often root crops from the monastery garden, provided a watery, bland addition. Meat was a rare luxury, often forbidden for long stretches, especially during fasting periods. Fish, if the monastery was near water, might offer a brief reprieve from the monotony. The gnawing sensation of hunger, a subtle ache that never quite fully receded, became a familiar companion. It was not the sharp, immediate hunger of starvation, but a persistent, low-grade emptiness that settled in the stomach, draining the body of its warmth and vitality. The deliberate act of abstaining from food, of as feeling the body's protests, was considered a spiritual exercise, a victory over the carnal desires. Yet this constant deprivation took a significant physical toll on health and mind. The body felt perpetually cold, its internal furnace lacking sufficient fuel. Muscles, though strong from labor, often ached with a deep, persistent weariness that no amount of sleep could fully erase. The skin might grow sallow, the eyes sunken, reflecting the internal depletion. The mind, too, suffered under this constant regimen. Concentration, already taxed by endless prayer and rote memorization, could become more difficult, prone to wandering, to a dullness that defied spiritual effort. Thoughts might become sluggish, or conversely, agitated by the underlying hunger. The very act of thinking, of reasoning, felt like a drain on already limited reserves. The scent of cooking from a distant village, carried on the wind, could evoke a sudden, sharp pang of longing, a visceral reminder of the world's forgotten comforts, the feeling of a stomach contracting. A quiet rumble in the deep silence of the refectory was a constant, intimate sensation. The greatest, most pervasive physical reality of monastic life was the cold. It was an unyielding, omnipresent force, a constant presence that permeated every stone, every breath, every silent moment, particularly during the long, unforgiving months of winter. The monastic buildings, with their thick, ancient walls, were almost entirely unheated stone structures. The stone, noble and enduring, absorbed the chill of the earth and the biting air, radiating a pervasive cold that seeped into the very bones. There was no warmth save that which emanated directly from the communal hearths in the kitchen or refectory, or the faint warmth of a lamp carried in the dark corridors. As one moved away from these sources, the chill asserted itself, relentless and profound. In the dormitory, where rows of straw mattresses lay on rough wooden frames, the air was often frigid. Breath would mist in the air, hanging visible before the face. During the depths of winter, water left in jugs near the beds would often become frozen water jugs, a solid block of ice, a stark reminder of the extreme cold. The very act of reaching for water in the morning only to find it unyielding was a small daily shock, a visceral confrontation with the pervasive chill. To wash one's face in such conditions, or to even attempt a rudimentary cleansing, was an act of grim determination against the biting cold. The touch of anything metallic, a bucket handle or a latch, would send a sharp, almost painful jolt of cold through the fingers. This constant exposure to the cold, combined with poor nutrition and often inadequate clothing, led to persistent physical ailments. Chilblains, painful swellings, and itching on the fingers and toes were a common affliction, a constant, irritating reminder of the extreme conditions. The skin would feel taut, dry, and often cracked, especially on the hands, bleeding from the constant exposure and lack of moisture. A deep, pervasive chill would settle in the limbs, making movement stiff and painful. The feeling of aching joints, of numb extremities, was a constant companion. Beyond these discomforts, the cold contributed to a general susceptibility to sickness. The body, already weakened, struggled to resist the persistent dampness and chill that permeated the monastic buildings. Coughs, lingering colds, and deeper chest ailments were common, exacerbated by the cold, damp air drawn into the lungs with every breath. The sound of a persistent cough, a dry hack echoing in the silent corridors, was a familiar and unsettling sound, a reminder of the body's vulnerability. A low fever might settle in, making the cold feel even more intense, wrapping the body in a shivering misery. Disease and death in silence were grim realities of monastic life, handled with a quiet resignation that spoke of their inevitability. When illness struck, it was often with a swift, unforgiving hand. The body, already weakened by austerity and toil, offered little resistance. There were no elaborate medical interventions, no sophisticated treatments. Healing was often left to God, to prayer, and to the simplest of remedies. When a monk fell ill, they were often moved to the infirmary, a separate, designated space within the monastery walls. The infirmary, though slightly warmer than the regular dormitories, was still a place of quiet suffering. The air would carry the distinct, heavy smell of sickness, the sharp tang of sweat, the faint aroma of vomit or bodily waste, the lingering scent of unwashed linens, the sound of shallow, labored breathing, of a low moan suppressed, of the restless shifting of a feverish body. These were the sounds of the infirmary. How illness was handled was often a matter of quiet observation and simple care. A sick monk would be given thin gruel, perhaps a slightly richer broth if their condition was dire. Herbal poultices might be applied to aching limbs or inflamed chests, their earthy scent mingling with the smell of sickness. Cool cloths might be placed on a fevered brow, their dampness offering fleeting relief. But mostly, it was a time of quiet endurance, of waiting. The suffering was borne largely in silence, a personal penance, a further purification of the soul. There were no loud laments, no frantic cries for aid. The other monks, moving quietly through their duties, would offer a silent prayer, a brief glance of concern before returning to their prescribed tasks. The feeling of the coarse, damp cloth on hot skin, the taste of bitter herbal infusions, the persistent cough that racked the body. These were the sensory markers of illness. And then came the lonely deaths in the infirmary. For many, the end came not in the comforting presence of family or the familiar sounds of a childhood home, but in the hushed, solitary confines of the infirmary. The final breaths would be drawn in silence, witnessed perhaps only by a few attending monks, or by no one at all. The very air in the infirmary seemed to hold the echoes of these quiet departures, a heavy stillness that spoke of finality. The last conscious sensations might be the rough feel of the linen against the fevered skin, the distant murmur of prayers from the chapel, or simply the cold, unyielding presence of the stone walls. The immediate aftermath involved the communal, solemn duty of burying fellow monks. The body, now cold and still, would be prepared with simple reverence. It would be washed, its limbs straightened, then wrapped in a plain linen shroud, often without a coffin, simply placed directly into the earth. The procession to the monastic graveyard, often a simple plot of ground within the cloister walls, would be silent, save for the soft shuffle of many feet on the earth, and the low, solemn chanting of funerary psalms. The scent of fresh dug earth, cold and damp, would fill the air. The sound of the shovel scraping against the soil, then the soft thud of earth returning to earth, would mark the final departure. It was a stark reminder of mortality, a tangible representation of the fragility of the flesh and the relentless march of time. Each burial was a quiet lesson, a reaffirmation of the ephemeral nature of earthly existence and the ultimate destination of all bodies back to the dust from which they came. The cold wind on the exposed faces during the burial, the chill seeping from the newly turned earth, underscored the raw reality of death. Beyond the physical trials, a constant internal torment gnawed at the spirit, the fear of sin. It was a pervasive, suffocating presence, woven into the very fabric of monastic life, amplified by the relentless focus on spiritual purity. The world outside the monastery walls was seen as a hotbed of temptation, a source of endless opportunities for transgression. But even within the seemingly holy confines of the cloister, sin lurked, insidious and ever-present in the very thoughts and desires of the individual. The obsession with purity permeated every aspect of existence, not just purity of body, but purity of thought, of intention, of spirit. Every action, every feeling, every fleeting impulse was scrutinized against the unwavering standard of divine law. A moment of anger, a flicker of pride, a fleeting memory of a worldly pleasure. These were not minor failings, but grave offenses, potentially damning to the soul. The mind became a battlefield, constantly warring against its own natural inclinations, striving for an impossible state of perfect inner stillness and devotion. The feeling of a subtle impurity, a hidden stain, was a constant, gnawing sensation, a source of deep anxiety. The air, heavy with the weight of unseen judgment, seemed to press in from all sides. This obsession bred a profound shame. A shame not just for outward transgressions, but for the very existence of impure thoughts, of rebellious desires, even those unacted upon. This shame was often kept hidden, a secret burden carried within, feeding a sense of unworthiness, of inherent sinfulness. The head would hang low, the eyes would avoid direct gaze, reflecting this internalized burden. The silence of the cloister, while intended for contemplation, could also become a vast, echoing space for the magnification of this private shame, where every perceived failing resonated with amplified force. And always, there was the looming threat of punishment. This punishment was both divine and institutional. The fear of divine retribution, of the terrifying consequences in the afterlife, was the ultimate deterrent. The sermons, filled with vivid descriptions of hellfire and eternal damnation, painted a visceral picture of what awaited the unrepentant sinner. This fear was not abstract. It was a chilling bodily dread that tightened the chest, quickened the breath, and intensified the desperation for unwavering adherence to the rule. The very darkness of the chapel during night prayers, the flicker of a single lamp, could evoke terrifying images of the abyss. Institutional punishment, though less severe than divine wrath, was immediate and tangible. Errors in prayer, breaches of silence, signs of disobedience, these were met with various forms of penance designed to crush pride and instill conformity. Public confession of a minor transgression, kneeling for hours in the cold, unyielding chapel, a solitary meal of bread and water, or a period of strict silence beyond the usual rule. These were designed to humble the individual, to remind them of their unworthiness and their submission to the monastic authority. The feeling of cold stone beneath aching knees, the metallic taste of guilt in the mouth, the burning shame in the cheeks. These were the sensory experiences of institutional correction. The weight of the abbot's stern gaze, the silent disapproval of fellow monks, the quiet ostracization, these non-physical punishments could be profoundly effective in breaking the will. The ritual of confession and penance was a terrifying, yet necessary aspect of monastic life, designed explicitly to crush pride and will. It was a regular, often weekly, ritual, a confrontation with one's own inner darkness laid bare before an elder or the abbot. The air in the small enclosed space of the confessional or the abbot's private cell would feel heavy, thick with unspoken sins. The faint scent of stale breath, of old parchment, would hang in the air. As the monk knelt, perhaps on the cold stone, the words of confession would emerge slowly, haltingly, a painful extraction of hidden thoughts and desires. Every transgression, every impure thought, every moment of doubt or rebellion was to be revealed. The words, once spoken, hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their own admission. The sound of one's own voice, articulating these hidden shames, felt strange, alien, an act of profound vulnerability. The face would burn with shame. The heart would pound against the ribs. The hands would clench uncontrollably. The response from the confessor was often stern, unyielding, a reflection of the unbending nature of the rule. The voice, low and devoid of warmth, would pronounce the penance. Additional prayers, longer fasts, periods of complete silence, or humiliating acts of public submission. The purpose was clear: to extinguish the flame of individual pride, to break the stubbornness of the will, to humble the self into absolute obedience. The penance, once given, felt like a heavy stone settling upon the spirit, a burden to be carried until its completion. This ritual of stripping away the self, of constantly confronting one's own perceived sinfulness, was designed to erase the very notion of personal agency. The self was to be dissolved, purified, made utterly subservient to the divine and to the communal ideal. The profound sense of worthlessness that could emerge from this relentless self-scrutiny, this constant confession of perceived failings, was a heavy cloak worn by many. The cold stone of the confessional, the muted light, the solemn, unblinking gaze of the confessor, all these elements conspired to create an atmosphere where the individual will was systematically and continuously broken, leaving only a quiet, resigned acceptance of one's place in the vast, unyielding machinery of spiritual discipline. The smell of fear, subtle and metallic, would often mingle with the scent of humility. The crushing weight of confession and penance, the ceaseless demand for purity of thought, continued to press upon the spirit. The body, worn by poor nutrition and the pervasive cold, bore the marks of constant austerity. The scent of fear, subtle and metallic, lingered in the air after confession, mingling with the ever-present cold of the stone and the dry scent of ancient parchment. This relentless discipline sought to erase the self, to humble the will. Yet even in the starkest moments of monastic life, the human spirit, resilient and yearning, could find, or forge, unexpected pathways for its own quiet expression. Even within the unyielding confines of the monastic life, amidst the strictures and the privations, there were moments of quiet beauty. These instances, often fleeting and unbidden, pierced the monotonous rhythm, offering a glimpse of grace, a brief respite for the soul. They were not grand spectacles, but subtle occurrences, easily missed by a mind too accustomed to the drudgery. In the scriptorium, as the day faded and the natural light grew too dim for meticulous work, a monk might light a small candle. Its flame, a fragile beacon in the encroaching darkness, would cast a soft, wavering glow over the parchment. The light would illuminate the intricate script, making the ink glisten, revealing the subtle texture of the vellum. The air, cool and quiet, would carry the faint scent of beeswax from the burning candle, mingling with the dry, earthy smell of old books and the sharper tang of iron gall ink. The tiny flame would dance, making the shadows shift and lengthen, transforming the familiar space into something momentarily sacred, a pool of warm light against the vast, cold stillness. The careful stroke of a quill, rendered visible in the flickering light, became a precise, almost meditative gesture. This quiet illumination, a small contained warmth in the cold stone room, offered a brief moment of focused beauty, a visual stillness that transcended the physical discomfort. In the cloister garden, particularly in the spring or early summer, when the monks were released for their hours of manual labor, the air might suddenly be filled with birdsong. The clear, melodic notes, unaffected by human rules or solemnity, would ripple through the quiet courtyard, a vibrant tapestry of sound against the hushed murmur of the wind through the herbs. A small bird, hidden within the budding branches of a fruit tree, would sing with an uninhibited joy that felt almost illicit in its freedom. The crisp, green scent of growing things, of damp earth and blossoming flowers, would mingle with the sweet, clear sound. For a fleeting moment, the weight of the rule, the ache in the limbs, the ceaseless internal struggle would recede. The sound would pierce the careful walls of the spirit, connecting the monk to the wild, uncontained beauty of the natural world outside. This unbidden music, so pure and unadorned, was a whisper of grace, a reminder of a world beyond the stone and strictures. But these moments, precisely because of their unexpected purity, were always fleeting. They could not be grasped, could not be held on to. They arrived unannounced and departed just as swiftly, leaving behind only a faint echo, a subtle memory that quickly dissolved back into the pervasive reality of routine, of cold stone, of endless prayer and labor. The candle would burn down, its light absorbed by the encroaching darkness. The bird would take flight, its song fading into the vast silence. These brief instances of beauty served not as sustained comforts, but as sharp, poignant reminders of the world that had been renounced, of a freedom that was no longer theirs. They highlighted, by their very brevity, the prevailing austerity and the relentless discipline that defined every moment. Beneath the spiritual ideals of humility and self-denial, the monastic world was also a human world, subject to the same flaws and desires that governed life outside the cloister walls. The stark reality of hypocrisy and hierarchy often permeated the supposedly humble order. While ordinary monks endured constant fasting, meager meals, and cold, unheated cells, the abbots and other high-ranking officials often lived lives of considerably greater comfort. This was vividly apparent in how abbots lived better. Their chambers, often separate from the communal dormitories, might possess a private hearth, offering a warmth rarely experienced by the ordinary monk. The air in their rooms might carry the scent of finer materials, of seasoned wood, perhaps even a hint of spices brought from distant lands. Their meals, while still adhering to certain monastic forms, were often richer, more varied, perhaps including meat more frequently, or delicacies denied to the general community. The clinking of a metal goblet, the subtle aroma of a richer wine. These were sounds and scents rarely encountered beyond the abbot's private table. Their habits, while still humble in fabric, might be of a finer weave, cleaner, showing less wear and tear from arduous labor. The very posture of an abbot, often physically less strained, reflected a life of less physical deprivation. The warmth emanating from their private quarters, subtle but distinct, was a constant, unstated contrast to the pervasive cold of the common spaces. This disparity inevitably fueled power games within a supposedly humble order. The pursuit of influence, the subtle jockeying for position, the quiet maneuvering for favor with the abbot. These human dramas played out within the silent walls. The monastic hierarchy, though ostensibly based on spiritual merit, could become a stage for ambition. A nod of approval from a prior, a glance of recognition from the abbot, a slightly warmer tone in an assigned task. These small signals held immense weight in a world where personal agency was otherwise denied. The air might thicken with unspoken tension during certain communal gatherings, a subtle undercurrent of competition beneath the veneer of piety. The very silence, intended to foster spiritual contemplation, could also become a breeding ground for suspicion, for unspoken rivalries, for the quiet resentment that simmered beneath the faced conformity. A monk might observe a favored brother receiving lighter duties or a more comfortable place by the fire, and a quiet, unbidden thought of injustice might momentarily pierce the discipline of his mind. For some, the relentless discipline, the gnawing hunger, the pervasive cold, the crushing of individual will became too much to bear. The yearning for a different life, for the warmth of the world outside the stone walls, could become an unbearable ache. These were those who tried to escape. The decision to flee was not made lightly. It carried immense risk, both physical and spiritual. The thought would often begin as a faint whisper, a forbidden fantasy during the long hours of silent labor or prayer, gradually growing into a desperate conviction. The act of escape itself was perilous. It meant slipping away in the dead of night, in the profound darkness before matins, when the monastery was at its stillest and coldest. The sound of one's own heart pounding in the chest, the harsh scrape of a habit against rough stone, the subtle creak of a hidden door. These were the terrifying sounds of a desperate bid for freedom. The cold night air outside the monastery walls, once a source of dread, would suddenly feel vast and exhilarating, a breath of true, untamed liberty. The smell of the wild, of damp earth and unknown forests would fill the lungs, a potent antidote to the cloistered air. But the consequences for those who were caught or who returned were severe and unforgiving. The monastic order, built on absolute obedience and unwavering commitment, viewed escape as a profound betrayal. The punishment was designed to be a terrifying deterrent, a public humiliation meant to crush the spirit and reinforce the absolute power of the rule. A monk who had fled and been recaptured would be dragged back to the monastery, often in chains, their face a mask of exhaustion and despair. The return would be marked by a public ritual of penance, designed to break the will. They might be forced to lie prostrate at the entrance to the refectory or in the chapel for days, while the other monks stepped over their prone body, a symbol of their abject failure and submission. Their habit might be stripped away, replaced by a rougher, more humiliating garment. Their rations might be reduced to water and the driest, coarsest bread, a deliberate form of starvation. They might be subjected to prolonged periods of silence, even more profound than the monastic norm, a terrifying isolation within the communal space. The eyes of their fellow monks, devoid of pity, would be fixed upon them, witnessing the harsh justice. The sound of their own ragged breathing, the taste of ashes in their mouth, the cold, unyielding pressure of the stone floor against their body. These were the visceral sensations of profound degradation. The scent of their fear, sharp and acrid, would permeate the air around their prone form. This spectacle was a stark reminder to all who witnessed it of the unbreakable grip of the monastic life and the futility of resistance. Even for those who remained, who never attempted physical escape, the mind could still wander, could still rebel in the secret spaces of the inner self. Within the confines of the monastic library or a hidden corner of the scriptorium, a monk might encounter forbidden books. These were not necessarily texts of heresy, but perhaps works of ancient poetry, philosophical treatises from pagan thinkers, or even medical texts that hinted at a knowledge beyond divine scripture. The touch of the smooth, aged parchment, the subtle scent of ancient ink, the quiet rustle of pages, these sensations were charged with a thrilling danger. To read such a book was an act of quiet defiance, a surreptitious opening of the mind to ideas and beauty beyond the prescribed limits. The words would shimmer, vibrant and alive, filling the mind with concepts that challenged the rigid framework of the rule, stirring a dangerous intellectual curiosity. This clandestine reading, combined with the relentless introspection of monastic life, could lead to secret thoughts. These were the unvoiced doubts about doctrine, the quiet questioning of the abbot's authority, the subtle resentments towards the endless routines. These thoughts, carefully guarded, would gnaw the edges of the mind, a persistent whisper against the dominant chorus of prayer and obedience. The heart might quicken at their emergence, a silent acknowledgement of their dangerous nature. The very act of holding such thoughts, of allowing them to linger, was a continuous act of internal rebellion, a tiny assertion of self in a world that sought its complete annihilation. The air around one might feel thick with the weight of these unspoken secrets, and sometimes, in the deepest stillness of the night or during a moment of profound weariness, the past would rise unbidden, bringing with it emotional longing, a memory of a mother's touch, the sound of a sibling's laughter, the soft scent of a childhood home, or, most dangerously, the vibrant, visceral memory of a former love. These were the moments when monks who doubted felt the sharpest pangs of regret, the deepest aches of separation, the image of a beloved face, the remembered touch of a hand, the phantom scent of a particular perfume. These would flood the senses, overwhelming the carefully constructed defenses of austerity and detachment. Tears, silent and unbidden, might track down a worn, unwashed cheek, a testament to the enduring power of human connection, even in its absence. These were the souls who remembered love, not as an abstract concept, but as a felt, tangible reality. The ache in the chest, the hollowness in the belly, the warmth that briefly blossomed, then faded, leaving a chilling emptiness. These were the physical manifestations of a longing that defied all spiritual discipline. The chants, the prayers, the labor seemed utterly meaningless in the face of this profound human ache. The silence of the night, intended for contemplation, would instead be filled with the ghostly echoes of a life unlived, a love forsaken. And in these moments of intense longing, some would dream of leaving. The idea would present itself not as a desperate escape, but as a gentle fantasy, a quiet path leading away from the cold stone, towards a sun-drenched field, towards the familiar sounds of a village, towards the possibility of human connection. The scent of wildflowers, the warmth of genuine laughter, the simple comfort of a familiar voice. These were the ephemeral components of the dream. The longing was so profound that it manifested as a physical sensation, a subtle tension in the muscles, a quiet flutter in the chest. But the consequences of actual escape, the fear of eternal damnation, the sheer impossibility of reintegration into the outside world, held them fast. And so the dreams remained dreams, dissolving with the first chime of matins, leaving only a lingering ache, a quiet resignation. For those who stayed for decades, living out the long, slow rhythm of monastic life, the journey led to different, profound transformations. The constant pressure of the rule, the relentless austerity, the psychological and physical deprivations slowly but inexorably shaped the very core of their being. This was the slow erosion of faith, not necessarily a loss of belief in God, but a transformation of one's relationship with the divine and with oneself. What happened to those who endured for decades? Their paths diverged into distinct, often solitary territories. Resignation, madness, or a profound, almost terrifying transformation. For many, the long years led to a profound resignation. It was not a bitter, angry surrender, but a quiet, almost peaceful acceptance of their fate. The initial fervor, the burning desire for spiritual perfection, would slowly dim, replaced by a deep, unwavering sense of duty. The routines, once arduous, became second nature, a series of ingrained habits performed without conscious thought. The chants, repeated thousands of times, became a drone, a rhythmic accompaniment to the flow of internal quiet. The cold of the stone, the taste of bland food, the relentless silence. These ceased to be trials and became simply the way the world was, the expected texture of existence. The body moved through its prescribed motions with an almost mechanical precision, devoid of overt emotion. The eyes would hold a distant, knowing gaze, reflecting a vast inner stillness, a calm born of endless repetition and the quiet relinquishing of all personal desire. The scent of old habits, of long settled dust, became their own scent, an indistinguishable part of their being. For some, however, the relentless pressure, the constant suppression of self, the internal battles against intrusive thoughts and forbidden desires, led to a slow, creeping descent into madness. The mind, unable to find an outlet for its complexities, would begin to unravel. Whispers might be heard in the silence, imagined voices offering forbidden comfort or terrifying judgment. A monk might begin to speak in nonsensical phrases or engage in repetitive, compulsive behaviors that deviated from the rule, yet offered a strange internal logic. The eyes might hold a vacant stare or flicker with an unnerving intensity. The body might become restless, unable to find peace in stillness, or conversely, might sink into a profound stupor. This was a private torment, largely unacknowledged or misunderstood by others, seen perhaps as a test of faith, a manifestation of unconfessed sin, or simply an unfortunate affliction. The air around such a person might feel thin, brittle, charged with an invisible fragility. The soft, incoherent murmurs, the restless movements, the unseen gaze, these were the tragic, quiet sounds of a mind broken by the relentless pursuit of an impossible ideal. And then there were those who experienced a profound, almost mystical transformation. For these rare souls, the long decades of austerity and discipline, of relentless self-abnegation, led not to emptiness, but to an unearthly clarity. The body, stripped of its desires, became a vessel for a deeper, more pervasive spiritual connection. The mind, emptied of worldly thoughts, became a vast, silent space, receptive to truths beyond human comprehension. The daily routines, the chants, the labor, these transcended their mundane form and became direct pathways to the divine. The cold stone, the hunger, the silence, these were no longer deprivations, but instruments of grace, refining the spirit. Their eyes would hold a profound, luminous stillness, a depth that seemed to encompass vast distances. Their movements, slow and deliberate, would possess an almost ethereal grace. They would move through the cloister like shadows. Their presence felt more as a whisper of ancient wisdom than a physical form. The air around them might feel strangely still, permeated by a silent, powerful reverence. They would rarely speak, but when they did, their words would carry the weight of profound insight, a distillation of decades of silent contemplation. This was a transformation beyond suffering, a transcendence that truly mirrored the ideal of the monastic life, a quiet, almost terrifying union with the unseen. As the long, long day began its final, gentle descent, the light within the ancient stone walls of the monastery softened further, deepening into the rich, velvety hues of twilight. The dust motes, which had danced earlier in the shafts of daylight, now hung almost motionless in the cooler, heavier air, catching the last, faint glimmer from the few lanterns being lit. The sounds of the day, the distant clang of a bell, the soft shuffle of feet on stone, the rhythmic scratching of a quill, all gradually receded, becoming indistinct echoes in the growing stillness. A single hand, worn and slightly trembling from decades of labor and cold, might reach out slowly to touch the smooth, cool surface of a piece of parchment. The texture, familiar and reassuring, offered a quiet comfort. The faint scent of old ink, of aged paper, would rise, a ghost of countless hours spent in meticulous copying. Nearby, a candle, its flame a solitary flicker in the vast dimness of the scriptorium, cast long, wavering shadows across the work surface, making the familiar shapes of the room appear vast and mysterious. The scent of its burning wax, subtle and warm, mingled with the pervasive cold of the stone. The air, now heavy with the profound silence of the approaching night, seemed to absorb all sound, all movement, all thought. The rough wool of the habit, a familiar rasp against the skin, felt like a second skin, its texture now completely ingrained, a constant, unremarked presence. The sound of one's own breath, slow and deep, would fill the immediate space around the body, a quiet, rhythmic confirmation of continued existence, a subtle movement against the overwhelming stillness. The subtle, persistent scent of old habits and ancient stone, of lingering wood smoke and unwashed bodies, formed a singular, pervasive aroma that was simply the air of this place. The final impression is one of profound, unyielding stillness. The story does not end with a resolution or a grand statement, but simply dissipates, like the last wisp of smoke curling upwards from a forgotten chimney, dissolving into the vast, indifferent darkness of the medieval sky. The images soften, the sounds become almost imperceptible, the sensations blur and recede into the realm of timeless memory. The light of day, having faded entirely, leaves a tired, unwashed face in profound shadow, its contours softened by the absence of sharp illumination. The eyes, though unseen, have a quiet depth, holding the echoes of decades of silence, of struggle, of profound resignation or fleeting beauty. The very breath becomes quieter, the heart beats slower, as if aligning with the deeper, ancient pulse of the earth itself. The story does not conclude. It simply fades, like a distant whisper carried on the wind, leaving only the lingering sense of a long, slow passage, a gentle vanishing into the vast, unbroken silence of the past.